Imagine waking up on a massive, highly advanced ship. You look around, and everything is just humming with this incredible high-tech efficiency. The navigation systems are flawless, the engines are roaring, and all the data readouts on the bridge are just perfectly optimized.
Right. It looks like a marvel of engineering.
Exactly. But then you decide to take a walk down to the engine room. You look a little closer at the furnace, and you realize, with this slow, creeping dread, that the ship isn't burning coal. It's not burning uranium. It's not running on solar power. It's burning the passengers.
Wow. Yeah.
It is literally using the life force, the time, and the physical bodies of the people on board to keep those engines running. And honestly, the wildest part, the crew up on the bridge, they're staring at the speed readouts, giving each other high fives, and they are calling it progress.
It is such a chilling image, and it perfectly captures a vessel where the instruments of survival have quietly, almost invisibly, become the masters of the people they were originally meant to serve. I mean, the systems have completely reorganized themselves so that the passengers now serve the systems.
And the crew is calling it progress. That terrifying flip, where the tools we built to survive end up literally demanding our lives to keep running, that is the core focus of our deep dive today. Welcome in.
Thanks for having me.
The deep dive takes a stack of your sources like articles, research, your own notes, and we extract the most important nuggets of knowledge or insight. You can think of it as kind of a shortcut to being well-informed. Today we are looking at a massive new framework drawn from an incredibly dense monograph. It's titled Life-Coherent Civilization, From World-Bringing to Participatory Repair, and it's by Dr. Bichara Sahely.
It's a heavy text.
It really is. And our mission today is to unpack this framework, to understand exactly how our society became this inverted ship. And, much more importantly, how we might actually take back the wheel.
Yeah, but before we start dissecting the engine room, so to speak, it is absolutely vital to establish the parameters of our discussion today. Because the text we are examining, it contains very strong systemic critiques of our dominant economic, political, and even legal paradigm.
Oh, absolutely. It challenges everybody.
Right. It challenges orthodoxies on all sides of the political spectrum. So I want to be clear that our goal in this deep dive is not to endorse a specific political side, nor to advocate for a particular ideology. We are here to impartially unpack the original author's framework.
We're just the messengers here.
Exactly. Our role is to act as a clear lens, helping you, the listener, understand the profound and honestly quite challenging ideas contained in this source material without taking any sides ourselves.
We are literally just the guides walking you through the architecture of this text. And to understand how our systems became so inverted, Dr. Sahely builds his argument on the shoulders of three foundational thinkers. So we'll be looking at Humberto Maturana's Biology of the Observer, John McMurtry's concept of life value, and Johan Galtung's expanded definition of violence. Let's unpack this, starting with the very first pillar, which is Humberto Maturana. Because to fix the ship, the text argues, we first have to fundamentally understand how human beings interact with reality.
Right.
We don't just passively sit in a pre-made world. The text actually calls us world-bringing animals.
Yes, and that is the core insight drawn from Maturana, who, by the way, was a brilliant theoretical biologist. And to really understand this concept of world-bringing, we have to start with our biology. Specifically, we have to look at our vulnerability, because human beings are born biologically unfinished.
Biologically unfinished. I mean, compared to other animals, right.
Exactly. Think about an infant. A human infant cannot survive on its own. It cannot regulate its own temperature. It can't find food. It can't even enter into complex communication without intense, prolonged care from other humans.
Yeah, we don't really have a fixed environmental niche like a lot of other animals do.
Mm-hmm.
Like a sea turtle hatches on the beach and immediately knows to just scramble toward the ocean. It has a program, we hatch and just kind of, we need everything done for us for basically a decade.
Right, we are deeply vulnerable. But that biological unfinishedness is actually also our greatest evolutionary openness. Because we aren't locked into one specific, rigid ecological niche, we are culturally open. We don't just adapt to a single environment. We transform environments into worlds.
Worlds of meaning.
Worlds of meaning, worlds of obligation, of law, of commerce, of religion. And we do this through what Maturana calls distinctions.
Distinctions.
Yeah.
Making a choice to, draw a conceptual line around something and name it. I was reading the notes on this before we started, and there's an example about a river that really clarified it for me.
Oh, that's a great example. Walk us through it.
So think about a physical river. You have the water, the current, the rocks, and the riverbed. That's a physical reality, right?
Right.
It's objectively there. But how a civilization distinguishes that river changes literally everything. If a society distinguishes that river as a resource, it brings forth a world of extraction.
It becomes something to use.
Exactly. It becomes something to be dammed up, diverted, utilized for industrial cooling, and eventually polluted because its only recognized value is its utility to the economy.
And then if you look at that exact same physical watercourse, the exact same rocks and water, but a society distinguishes it as a civil commons or maybe as a sacred entity or even as a legal person, which, by the way, is something we are actually seeing in modern jurisprudence in places like New Zealand and Ecuador, it brings forth an entirely different world.
A completely different reality for that river.
Right. A world of protection, of reciprocal obligation, of monitoring, of reverence. The physical water hasn't changed a single drop, but the world enacted around it has radically shifted based solely on the distinction the observer made.
Which means we are quite literally building the reality we inhabit based on the labels and the categories we create.
Right.
If you apply this to your daily life, to you as a listener, think about how you view the empty dirt lot down the street from your house.
Oh, yeah, that's a very practical way to see it.
Right, because if your city distinguishes it as prime commercial real estate, it becomes a strip mall. But if the neighborhood distinguishes it as a community garden space, it becomes a hub for local food and socializing. The dirt is just dirt. The distinction is what builds the world.
And this leads us into one of Maturana's most famous, and I'd say perhaps most complex, biological concepts, which is autopoiesis.
Autopoiesis, yeah, that's a heavy academic word right there. Let's break that down so it's actually useful for the listener.
It sounds intimidating, but it's quite elegant. So auto meaning self, and poiesis meaning creation or production. Maturana and his colleague Francisco Varela coined this term to describe the fundamental nature of living systems.
Self-creation.
Exactly. A living system, whether that's a single biological cell, a human being, or even a whole society, is a self-producing organization. It constantly regenerates the very components that make it up. It maintains its own boundary and its own identity in relation to its environment.
So it's not like a machine that is built from the outside in, right? Because, like, a car is assembled on a factory line by external robots. But a cell is building itself from the inside out, constantly repairing its own membrane to stay alive.
That's the perfect way to put it. And from this biological reality, Maturana makes a really crucial distinction between a system's organization and its structure. And this is the key to diagnosing our entire civilizational crisis, the whole, burning the passengers problem we talked about.
Okay, organization versus structure.
Right. The organization of a system refers to its core purpose, the essential relations that literally must exist for it to be what it is. The structure, on the other hand, refers to the physical or institutional components that embody that organization at any given time.
I was trying to map this onto, like, everyday institutions we all deal with. Is it fair to say organization is essentially the soul or the core mission of the system, and structure is just the body or the bureaucracy?
Yes, that works.
So, for example, a school. The organization of a school is the facilitation of learning, curiosity, and human development. But the structure is the physical brick buildings, the standardized tests, the administrative hierarchy, the bell schedules.
That maps perfectly. And Dr. Sahely's text warns of a massive category error that civilizations repeatedly make. We become so obsessed with preserving and expanding the structure that we completely lose sight of the life-serving organization.
We forget why we built it in the first place.
Precisely. A school might build massive new athletic facilities, administer way more rigorous standardized tests, and create this sprawling administrative apparatus. So it's expanding its structure. But at the same time, it might be entirely losing the actual organization of learning and world opening.
It just becomes a credentialing factory instead of a place of learning. The structure survives. Honestly, it might even thrive financially. But the original organization just dies. And we see this everywhere. I mean, think about a hospital.
That's the classic example.
Right. The core organization of a hospital is healing the sick.
Yeah.
But the structure is the billing departments, the insurance coding, the processing times. So when a hospital expands its billing department to maximize revenue, but it cuts nursing staff to save money, the structure is flourishing while the organization of actual healing is degraded.
And the crucial piece here, going back to Maturana, is the observer. You, me, the hospital administrator, the policymaker, we are all part of this autopoietic system. Maturana insists there is no view from nowhere.
We're all in the fishbowl.
We are. Every observation, every policy decision is made by a living being embedded in a structure, making distinctions based on their own history and their own language.
Okay, I do have to push back here for a second, because this can quickly sound like a very postmodern, like everything is just a subjective illusion kind of philosophy. And I want to make sure we're being grounded, because gravity exists whether I distinguish it or not.
Of course.
Like if I jump off a roof, I'm going to hit the concrete, regardless of what my culture calls gravity. Are we saying reality is just in our heads? That we
Yeah.
just sort of manifest the world with our thoughts?
I'm glad you brought that up because it is a very common misinterpretation, and the text specifically guards against it. Maturana is absolutely not saying physical reality is a hallucination. The organism is still structurally coupled to a physical medium.
The physical world is still there.
Yes. If you jump off a roof, your biological organization will violently fail when you hit the concrete. That is an absolute limit of the physical medium. The concrete honestly does not care about your cultural distinctions.
Right. It's not going to suddenly become a trampoline just because I call it one.
Exactly. What Maturana is saying is that human beings never encounter that physical ground without a distinction.
Right.
We never interact with pure, unmediated reality. We interact with the reality our distinctions allow us to perceive.
I actually have an analogy for this that might help listeners visualize it. Think about a computer. You have the physical hardware, right? The silicon chips, the motherboard, the hard drive. That is physical reality. It exists. It has absolute limits.
Right.
You can't make a 500 gigabyte hard drive hold a terabyte of data. Physics won't allow it. But then you have the operating system, the OS, Windows, Mac OS, Linux. The OS is our language, our cultural distinctions.
Oh, that's interesting. Walk me through the implications of that.
So the hardware is undeniably real, but the OS dictates entirely what software can be run, how the files are organized, and what is visible or invisible to the user. Like a file might physically exist on the hard drive, stored as ones and zeros, but if your OS doesn't have the distinction or the code to recognize that specific file format, to the user, it effectively does not exist. It's totally invisible.
It can't be interacted with.
Exactly. Our language and our categories are the civilizational OS. The physical world is there, but our OS determines if a forest is seen as a timber reserve or as an ancestral habitat. We only see what the OS allows us to see.
That is a highly effective analogy for how Maturana views language. Because he doesn't view language just as a passive system of symbols that we use to point at things that already exist. He defines language as the coordination of coordination.
Coordination of coordination, meaning it's an active process of bringing people together to do things.
Words literally enact worlds. When an economic system labels a human being as human capital, it isn't just making a descriptive statement. It is coordinating a massive array of societal actions.
It's running a specific program in the OS.
Yes, it tells the education system to train that human specifically for the job market. It tells the employer to optimize them for yield. It tells the government to measure their worth by their economic output. If you change the label in the OS from human capital to citizen or living participant, you are suddenly required to coordinate a completely different set of institutional actions.
The words we use are literally the instruction manuals for our institutions. If you call someone a consumer, you treat them one way. If you call them a neighbor, you treat them entirely differently.
What's fascinating here is that this coordination isn't just intellectual or bureaucratic, it's deeply physiological. And this brings us to Maturana's concept of emotioning. And notice the ing there. He uses it as a verb.
Right. Emotioning as an active process, not just a state of being.
In this biological framework, emotions are not just private, subjective feelings that happen inside your head while the quote-unquote real world happens outside. Emotions define actual domains of action. They dictate biologically what is possible and what is impossible to do in a given moment.
So to put that in daily terms, if I'm terrified, say someone just broke into my house, the domain of actions available to me is physically and neurologically restricted. I am limited to fight, flight, or freeze. I physically cannot sit down and write a beautiful poem or build deep interpersonal trust while I'm in the biological domain of terror. My internal OS is locking out those programs.
Now, scale that biological reality up to an entire civilization, a society that is governed by the recurrent emotion of fear, fear of scarcity, fear of the outsider, fear of losing social status. That society operates entirely differently than a society governed by trust.
It builds totally different structures.
Exactly. A fearful society builds different laws, it fortifies borders, it guts social safety nets because it views everyone else as a competitor for scarce resources. The emotion dictates the structure.
And the text brings up love here, which I'll admit felt almost out of place when I first read it. because we were in this dense sociological critique of civilization, and suddenly we're talking about love. But it defines it very specifically, not as romance, right?
Yeah. Correct. It defines love biologically and structurally. In this framework, love is the relational domain in which you allow the other to be a legitimate participant in coexistence.
Allowing the other to be a legitimate participant. That's powerful.
It is, because if a society operates outside that domain, if its OS is built on contempt or superiority or endless extraction, it literally cannot see certain groups of people or the environment itself as legitimate participants. It can only see them as objects to be used or as obstacles to be removed.
Okay, this brings us to a massive threshold in the text. We now understand the first pillar. We enact worlds through our distinctions, our language, our civilizational OS. We bring the world forth. But here is the terrifying part of that realization. We can bring forth a world of harmonious coexistence, sure. Or we can bring forth a highly efficient, incredibly coherent, deeply oppressive slave economy.
Both are technically valid worlds brought forth by distinctions.
Right, so if we can enact any world, how do we know which world is actually good? Like, how do we evaluate it?
And that profound vulnerability, the realization that we could be coordinating a nightmare just as easily as a utopia, leads us directly to the second thinker in Dr. Sahely's framework, which is John McMurtry.
Because world-bringing isn't enough on its own. We need a universal measuring stick to judge the world we just brought forth. We need a diagnostic tool.
We need a way to evaluate the distinctions we are making. And to do that, McMurtry introduces what he calls a life value onto axiology.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Onto axiology is a massive mouthful. Let's break that down for the listener before we move an inch further. Axiology is the philosophical study of value, right? Like what is good, what is bad.
Right.
So what does the onto add to that?
So onto refers to ontology, which is the study of being, of what actually physically exists. By combining them into onto axiology, McMurtry is saying that value isn't just some abstract, floating moral opinion that changes from culture to culture. Value is grounded in the objective physical reality of life itself. And he argues that modern civilization has been completely captured by a ruling value syntax, a corrupt OS that he calls money value.
Money value. The idea that the ultimate, unchallengeable measure of success is money making more money, regardless of the cost to anything else.
In a pure money value system, the sequence is incredibly simple. You invest money to generate more money. It honestly does not matter what the commodity is.
It doesn't matter what you're selling.
No, it doesn't matter if it's housing or healthcare or weapons or food or complex financial derivatives. If the end result is an increase in monetary return, the system's dashboard flashes green. It registers it as a success. It is a completely closed, self-referential loop.
Going back to our hook at the beginning, the ship's engines are running hotter and faster, the speed is increasing, and the crew is cheering even if the fuel is the passengers. The metric of speed is literally the only thing the system can see.
McMurtry radically contrasts this with life value. In a life value framework, the true measure of a society, a policy, or an economy is whether it enables life capacities. And life capacities are defined pretty broadly here. It's the ability of a human being, or even an ecosystem, to sense, to relate, to learn, to heal, to participate in the world. Anything that makes life flourish.
Yes. The formula is beautifully simple but honestly devastating to our current norms. Something is good if it enables life capacity. Something is bad if it disables life capacity.
It sounds so obvious when you say it out loud.
It does, but when you apply it as a diagnostic tool to our current systems, it exposes the Great Inversion immediately. The text uses a very potent biological metaphor here to illustrate what happens when money value takes over. The cancer metaphor.
I really want to dig into this because this metaphor isn't just used lightly as an insult, like calling something a cancer on society. The author uses it as a precise, literal, biological parallel.
Right. Biologically, what actually is cancer? Cancer is not just growth. A child growing taller is not cancer. A forest expanding is not cancer. Cancer is cellular growth that has become completely detached from its life function. It no longer serves the broader organism.
It goes rogue.
It only serves its own localized, infinite replication. It demands more and more resources. It vascularizes itself to steal nutrients from the rest of the body. It starves the surrounding healthy tissue until it eventually kills the host that sustains it.
Because the cancer cell has lost the distinction of the whole body, its OS has shrunk down to only recognize its own localized growth. It doesn't know it's killing the thing keeping it alive.
And McMurtry applies this directly to our civilizational models. When economic growth becomes completely detached from ecological limits, when it expands by exhausting human bodies through chronic stress and overwork, when it requires the liquidation of ancient forests and the acidification of oceans just to keep the GDP numbers rising quarter after quarter, it is operating exactly like a civilizational cancer. It is growth entirely detached from life function.
And the tragic part is, under money value, we celebrate the tumor getting bigger. We look at the stock market soaring while life expectancy drops or depression spikes, and we say on the news, the economy is doing great. We're literally measuring the mass of the tumor instead of the health of the host.
This raises an important question about how our world operates. If we are measuring success wrong, how are we measuring demand? How do our economic systems actually know what to produce and who to produce it for?
Well, the standard Econ 101 answer is that the market responds to demand. People want things, the market supplies them. It's supposed to be perfectly rational and perfectly efficient.
But the text makes a vital, devastating distinction between universal life necessities and manufactured wants. The market, as currently constructed under the money value OS, is structurally blind to actual human need. The market only sees demand if it is backed by purchasing power.
Okay, let's play that out for the listener. What does that actually look like on the ground? Give me an example.
Think of a starving child in a developing nation, or honestly, even in an impoverished neighborhood in a wealthy country. That child has an absolute biological life necessity for food and clean water.
Right.
If they do not get it, their life capacities will be permanently disabled or they will simply die. But if that child or their family has no money, they represent zero market demand. The market literally does not see them. They are invisible to the economic OS.
The system simply cannot process their biological need because it isn't formatted in the language of currency. It doesn't compute.
Meanwhile, a billionaire's desire for a third luxury yacht, or a tech company's desire for massive server farms to run redundant AI algorithms is heavily backed by purchasing power. So the market registers that as a massive urgent demand. It mobilizes incredible planetary resources, engineering talent, and labor to fulfill it immediately.
The system is perfectly logical within its own syntax. It's doing exactly what it was programmed to do. But it is deeply morally insane when measured by life value.
That is the Great Inversion in action, and it leads to what McMurtry calls the relentless assault on the civil commons.
The civil commons. This is a term we need to spend some time on because it's crucial to the whole framework. It's not just like a park or a public square, right? It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. It is broader and deeper than physical public property. The civil commons refers to any socially organized system that provides universal access to life goods, protecting people from the brutal whims of pure market dependence.
So we're talking about things like public health systems, clean municipal water, public education, libraries, universal social security, even environmental protections that keep the air breathable. Those are a form of civil commons.
Exactly. These are the shared foundations of life. They are the structures a society builds to ensure that life capacities are enabled for everyone, regardless of their purchasing power. They act as a buffer against the pure logic of money value. But under the ruling syntax of our current system, the civil commons is viewed not as the bedrock of society, but as an unexploited market. It is viewed as value that hasn't yet been monetized.
It's seen as a frontier to be conquered.
And that conquest is called enclosure. Enclosure is the process of privatizing these commons, taking a shared life condition and converting it into a commodity that can only be accessed with money.
Let's contextualize this, because enclosure isn't a new idea. If we look back at history, the original enclosures happened in England, right? Wealthy landowners literally put physical fences around common grazing land that peasants had used for centuries to feed themselves.
Yes.
They kicked the peasants off, put sheep on the land for the wool trade, and basically forced the peasants into the cities to become wage laborers in factories.
That is the historical template, but the text argues that enclosure is happening right now, constantly, across all domains of modern life. We take a public water system, privatize it, and suddenly a community is paying a premium for the basic biological necessity of hydration, with profits siphoned off to distant shareholders instead of being used to maintain the local pipes.
We see digital enclosures, too. Information that used to be freely shared gets paywalled or algorithmically restricted unless you pay a subscription. Enclosure basically converts a fundamental life right into a consumer choice.
And this reframes our entire understanding of freedom, because the dominant cultural narrative tells us that privatization and free markets maximize our freedom of choice.
I was actually thinking about this narrative of market freedom, and I came up with an analogy that I think clarifies why McMurtry finds it so flawed. Imagine you are locked in a sealed room, and the oxygen is slowly being pumped out. You are gasping for air. Suddenly, a free market oxygen vendor steps into the room.
Okay, setting this here.
They offer you incredible freedom. You can buy oxygen from vendor A or vendor B. You can buy premium oxygen with a hint of lavender, or you can get budget oxygen. You have total market choice. You are a perfectly free consumer.
The logic is flawless until you check your pockets.
Exactly. If you don't have the money in your pocket, you suffocate. You have total market freedom, but zero actual freedom, because your biological life necessity has been enclosed and monetized. Real freedom, in the life value sense, requires guaranteed access to the civil commons. You cannot be a truly free citizen if you are constantly terrified of dying from a preventable disease because you can't afford the entry fee to the healthcare system. The anxiety alone disables your life capacity.
Your oxygen analogy is stark, but it perfectly illustrates the text argument. When a society prioritizes money value over life value, it inevitably degrades the civil commons. It leaves the population exposed, vulnerable, and chronically insecure, essentially fighting each other for basic survival.
Okay, so we know how to measure good versus bad using life value. But if these systems are failing us so obviously, why aren't we calling it what it is? When a community loses its clean water or when people go bankrupt from medical debt, why do we just accept it as bad luck or like a policy shortcoming? Why do we just accept the way things are?
Because our OS likes the vocabulary to describe what is actually happening to us. When the life capacity of human beings or the planet itself is avoidably disabled by the systems we have built, we must name it accurately if we ever hunt to repair it. And that narrative necessity leads us to the final piece of our foundational triad, which is the sociologist Johan Galtung and his expanded definition of violence.
Because usually when we hear the word violence, we think of an action movie, a punch, a gunshot, a riot, an explosion. We think of a very specific physical event.
Galtung calls that direct violence. It is the visible, easily identifiable harm. There is a clear actor, a clear action, and a clear victim. It is terrible, and societies are generally very good at recognizing it, writing laws against it, and mobilizing police or military to stop it. But Galtung argues this is only the tip of the iceberg. He proposes the violence triangle. And the second point of the triangle, and the one most relevant to the Great Inversion, is structural violence.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Structural violence. Harm that is literally built into the blueprint. This is where the whole framework clicks into place for me.
Structural violence is the avoidable harm that is baked into social and economic arrangements. It doesn't require a bad guy pulling a trigger or throwing a punch. It is the slow, invisible violence of a system operating exactly as it was designed to.
Let's give some concrete examples of this so you, the listener, can spot it in your own world. We're talking about things like poverty, preventable diseases, unequal life chances based purely on the zip code you were born in.
Consider city zoning laws. If a municipality consistently zones heavily polluting industrial facilities in low-income neighborhoods, the resulting asthma and cancer rates in those neighborhoods are not an accident. They are a predictable outcome of the structure.
The text makes a profound point here. When harm is patterned, predictable, and preventable, it is violence. If a society has the wealth, the resources, and the knowledge to provide clean water or insulin, but it structures its economy so that a specific demographic routinely suffers or dies from lack of access, that is an act of violence. It is just mediated through bureaucracy, spreadsheets, and pricing models rather than a physical weapon.
It's the distance that makes it acceptable to the OS.
Yeah, it's the invisibility of it that makes it so insidious. It made me think of structural violence like a rigged board game. Imagine we sit down to play a game like Monopoly. We don't need to physically attack each other across the table. We don't need direct violence. We can be perfectly polite.
Right, we can have great manners.
But if the rules of the game are written so that mathematically you will be bankrupted, your properties will be taken, and you will be devastated no matter how intelligently you play, the violence isn't in my fist. The violence is in the rulebook.
That is a brilliant distillation. But it raises the next logical question. If the board game is so obviously rigged, and if the structural violence is causing so much pain, why don't the players slip the board? Why don't we revolt against it?
Right. Why do we just keep rolling the dice and accepting it?
Because of the third point of Galtung's triangle, which is cultural violence.
The narratives we tell ourselves to excuse the rigged game.
Exactly. Cultural violence consists of the ideologies, the language, the media narratives, the religious interpretations, and the cultural norms that legitimize the other two forms of violence. It is the cultural OS that makes the structural violence appear natural, necessary, or even deserved. It blinds us to the rigging of the game.
Think about the news you read this morning. How many times did an article describe a massive wave of corporate layoffs, which, by the way, devastates families and communities, as a necessary restructuring for efficiency? That phrasing is cultural violence right there in your daily feed. It justifies the structural harm by framing it as economic prudence.
Or consider poverty. When a society looks at people suffering under the structural violence of a low-wage, highly exploitative economy and calls them lazy, or says they just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that is cultural violence. It blames the player for losing the rigged game. It shifts the responsibility from the system's design to the individual's moral character.
Or in the realm of health, the text brings up how we look at populations suffering from metabolic diseases, which are largely caused by heavily subsidized, ultra-processed food environments and food deserts. And what does our culture call it? A lifestyle choice.
By calling it a lifestyle choice, the system completely absolves itself of the structural violence it just committed. It ignores the fact that healthy food has been enclosed and priced out of reach and shifts the blame entirely onto the individual's willpower.
It's a perfect defense mechanism for the OS. It makes the structure completely invisible. And this ties back to Maturana's idea of the observer, right? Institutions measure what they are designed to see.
Precisely. And they ignore what they are not programmed to value. Our economic systems measure gross domestic product GDP. If there is a massive oil spill and we have to spend millions of dollars cleaning it up, GDP goes up. The system registers a literal environmental disaster as economic growth.
Which is wild.
It is. Meanwhile, the system completely misses the massive vital economy of unpaid care, work, raising children, caring for elderly parents, maintaining households. This work is the literal foundation of human life. But because it isn't a monetized transaction, the OS can't see it. It is invisible to GDP.
Our health systems do the exact same thing. They measure prescriptions written, hospital beds filled, and billable hours. But they often completely miss the social determinants of health. The housing instability, the environmental toxins, the chronic stress of poverty that actually cause the illness in the first place.
So if we understand these 3 points of the violence triangle, it forces us to redefine what peace actually means. Galtung distinguishes between negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is just the absence of direct violence. It's a ceasefire. The guns stopped firing. People aren't rioting in the streets.
But the structural violence might still be firmly in place. It's a quiet oppression. The rigged game is still being played. Everyone is just suffering quietly.
Right. Positive peace, however, is the active participatory repair of the conditions that make life possible. It is the dismantling of structural violence and the rejection of cultural violence. It is the strengthening and expansion of the civil commons. Peace, in this framework, is not a static state of calm. It is an active, ongoing process of life-coherent reordering.
Okay, let's take a breath and look at the massive architecture we've just mapped out here. We have the complete foundational grammar of Dr. Sahely's text. We know that we build the world through our distinctions. That's Maturana. We know that we must measure that world by whether it enables life capacity. That's McMurtry. And we know that failing to do so creates structural violence wrapped in cultural justification. That's Galtung. We know the ship is inverted. We know the engines are burning the passengers. So the million-dollar question, how do we actually fix the vessel we are currently living in?
That is the pivot from diagnosis to action. The text acknowledges a harsh reality here. We are already inside the civilizational vessel. We cannot step outside of it, hover in a magical vacuum, and build a brand new utopian ship from scratch.
We can't just pause the game.
No, we have to reorder it from within while it's moving. We have to shift from world blindness, where we think the rigged game is just natural reality, to life coherence.
And to do that, the text provides a practical diagnostic tool, a way to basically check our navigation, the life coherence test.
It is a brilliant, multi-layered diagnostic that we can apply to absolutely anything. Whenever we are faced with a new law, a new technology, a new economic policy, or even a local community initiative, we must run it through this test. We must ask what world is being brought forth by this distinction, whose life capacities are being enabled and whose are being disabled. Are real biological and social needs being secured, or are we just feeding manufactured wants backed by purchasing power?
Right.
What structural violence might be hidden in this new policy, and what cultural narratives are we using to excuse it?
Let's actually apply this framework. Let's run the life coherence test on some specific domains because the text goes really deep into how this looks in practice. Let's look at health. Under the inverted system, health is just medical service delivery. You wait until you get sick, you go to a medical shop, they sell you a pill or a procedure, you leave. It's a transaction.
But under a life-coherent framework, health is not just repairing broken physical bodies. It is about repairing the worlds that damage those bodies in the first place. If a local clinic is treating 50 children a month for severe asthma, a life-coherent approach doesn't just ask how to secure more inhalers or how to optimize the billing for those inhalers.
Because that's just maintaining the structure.
Exactly. It runs a diagnostic. It asks why the air quality in that specific zip code is disabling the life capacity of those children. It identifies the industrial zoning or the highway placement as a form of structural violence, and it treats the environmental regulation as a necessary public health intervention.
It actually connects the dots. What about education? We touched on this a little bit earlier. Inverted education is a sorting mechanism. You memorize the data, pass the standardized test, and get the credentials so you can be optimized human capital for the money value market.
A life-coherent education system focuses on what the text calls world-opening development. It doesn't just train students to succeed within the existing flawed system. It gives them the capacity to critically perceive the world. It teaches them how to question the distinctions being made around them, how to recognize cultural violence, and how to participate in the repair of their own communities. It cultivates observers who are awake to their own world-bringing power.
And ecology. Under the money value OS, the Earth is just a background. It's a warehouse of raw resources to be extracted and a limitless trash can for industrial externalities.
Life coherence demands a profound paradigm shift here. We must recognize the Earth not as an environment that merely surrounds us, but as the absolute life ground that sustains us. We are autopoietic systems structurally coupled to the biosphere. We are not separate from it. If we degrade the life ground, we are quite literally degrading our own biological organization. As the saying goes, there is no economy on a dead planet.
So we have the diagnostic test. We know what a life-coherent system looks like. But how does the actual repairing happen? Who gets to make these changes? Because usually, when we talk about systemic change, we wait for a bunch of politicians or technocrats in a capital city to pass some massive omnibus bill.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text warns strongly against that approach. Top-down technocratic fixes almost always fail to achieve positive peace. Why? Because a group of well-meaning experts sitting in a distant office cannot adequately repair a local civil commons because they lack crucial, on-the-ground information. They are simply too far removed from the structural violence. They lack what the text calls affected knowers.
The affected knowers, that means the people actually suffering the structural violence.
Exactly. Repair cannot be an abstract, totalizing mandate imposed from above. It must involve the lived feedback of those who are experiencing the life disablement. Real governance in a life-coherent civilization is participatory repair.
Okay, I want to pause here and demand some concrete HOW. Not just what. How does participatory repair actually work? Give me a scenario of a community bypassing structural violence.
Let's construct a scenario based on the principles in the text. Imagine a community whose municipal water supply has been enclosed, privatized, and the corporation running it is cutting corners on maintenance to boost their profits. The water is becoming contaminated. The top-down technocratic fix might be for a distant regulatory agency to issue a small fine to the corporation, which the corporation just absorbs as a cost of doing business. The structural violence continues.
Right, the game is still rigged, the fine is just part of the budget.
Participatory repair looks completely different. The community, the affected knowers, gathers. They use the life coherence test. They name the situation accurately. They say this is not a service disruption, it is structural violence disabling their life capacity. They document the health impacts. But they don't stop at complaining. They form a local coalition, drawing on the skills of local plumbers, scientists, nurses, and organizers.
They use their own capacity.
Right. They might bypass the corporate structure entirely, By building a parallel, community-owned water filtration commons, they map the exact points of contamination. They leverage local legal tools to reclaim the water rights based on life value arguments, completely reframing the legal battle.
They aren't waiting for the OS to fix itself. They are rewriting a patch of code locally.
But I have to jump in with a massive grounding question here. This all sounds incredibly inspiring, but isn't it also deeply paralyzing?
How so?
If everything is connected, if health is connected to the economy, which is connected to ecology, which is connected to law, and it's all wrapped in cultural violence, how do we actually take a single step? How do you, the listener, wake up on a Tuesday and do anything without feeling totally overwhelmed by the sheer crushing scale of the Great Inversion? It is the most natural response to a systemic critique of this magnitude. Paralysis is a symptom of looking at the whole inverted ship at once. But Dr. Sahely anticipates this. The text emphasizes that we do not need a totalizing utopian blueprint to begin. We do not need to overthrow the entire global macroeconomic order before breakfast.
Thank goodness, because my Tuesdays are pretty booked.
We start exactly where life is already speaking. We start where life is visibly disabled in our immediate vicinity. We don't need to look for abstract problems. We look at our own lived experience. We find the nearest enclosed civil commons or the nearest instance of structural violence in our own profession, our own neighborhood, our own daily institution.
We apply the life coherence test locally.
Yes. We apply the test locally, we gather the affected knowers in that specific space, and we initiate what the text calls minimum sufficient repair.
Minimum sufficient repair. I love that phrase.
Yeah.
It's not about building a utopia overnight. It's just doing the next right thing to stop the bleeding and enable life.
Exactly. And then, crucially, we iterate based on the feedback from life. We don't act blindly based on an ideology. We act, we observe the consequences on life capacity, and we adjust. Civilization is repaired not by grand, violent ideological sweeps, but by a million localized acts of participatory repair, realigning our structures with life values step by step.
It's treating the civilization like a living ecosystem, not a machine. You don't rewrite the code all at once. You tend the garden where it's wilting. You see a policy at work that is burning people out, that's structural violence, you name it. You gather the affected knowers, your coworkers. You propose a minimum sufficient repair to management based on life value, not just productivity.
The ultimate wager of this monograph is profoundly realistic. It does not promise a world without friction. A life-coherent civilization doesn't abolish conflict. It doesn't magically erase uncertainty, disease, or tragedy. What it does is learn to constantly measure itself against the flourishing of life, rather than the metrics of its own inverted, self-serving systems. It builds a dashboard that flashes red not when corporate profits dip, but when life capacity is compromised.
That is a staggering wager. It completely changes the definition of a successful society. It shifts us from asking, how fast is the ship going, to, are the passengers thriving?
It returns the vessel to its rightful purpose.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Dr. Sahely's framework. But if you've listened to us before, you know we never like to leave you, the listener, without something concrete to chew on. We want to take this massive civilizational philosophy and make it real in your own world right now.
The transition from world blindness to world-bringing responsibility starts with a single observation.
So here is your challenging assignment, drawn straight from the principles we've unpacked today. Tomorrow, when you go to work, or when you are navigating your community, or even just looking at the apps on your phone and your daily habits, I want you to identify just one normal arrangement. Just one thing that everyone around you accepts is just the way it is. Maybe it's an aggressive performance metric at your job that guarantees burnout. Maybe it's a local zoning policy that pushes unhoused people out of sight instead of sheltering them. Maybe it's how your health insurance automatically denies a claim for unnecessary treatment.
Look closely at that normal arrangement, pierce through the cultural narrative excusing it.
Yes, look at it and ask yourself, is this actually structural life disablement wrapped up in a cultural justification? Is this the rigged board game presenting itself as fairness? And if you applied the life coherence test to that single normal thing, what new world might you be obligated to bring forth?
Because remember, we are not just passive passengers on this vessel. We are the ones building it every single day with every distinction we make.
The ship doesn't have to burn its passengers to move forward. We just have to be brave enough to look at the engine, name the violence, and rewrite the OS together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.